Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. I'm here to talk a little bit about week 15 and we're in the final countdown. So we only have 3 weeks of the semester left. I have week 14 visible on the screen just to remind you that I will be adding the week 15 video and lesson and discussion question links. Week 15 as soon as I finish recording this video. So I'm going to scroll down to week 15. And this week we're discussing the pages that you were assigned to read last week, which are pages 167 through 244. Also this week, as a reminder, you need to create and submit an outline for your final essay. So that's exciting. We're almost finished. One essay left to go. And I also have a link to the extra credit discussion questions should you want to do a little extra credit. Since you are creating an outline for this week, let's go ahead and take a look at the essay questions for Parable of the Sower. Hopefully you've looked at these already, but if you haven't, please take a look at them. If you have any questions about them, please let me know. Some of them I tried to make a little more creative, especially the first question. So this has to do with Beyonce's Lemonade and Octavia Butler. So looking at or analyzing the role of Black female protagonists both in Parable of the Sower and Lemonade, and to discuss how these protagonists bring awareness to contemporary real-world issues. So I think you could have fun with this topic. And if you kind of have other ideas that bounce off this, like Black Panther instead of Lemonade, whatnot, let me know. I am open to letting you write about something that's of interest to you specifically rather than what I've listed as topics for this assignment. So for the second topic, this has to do with analyzing the elements of Afrofuturism in the novel, and then to discuss how those elements combine imagination with social, political, and even religious practice to create a blueprint to find new ways to understand ourselves and the world around us. So I think this is also an interesting topic if you want to kind of delve a little away from just a traditional literary analysis of the book. So the rest of these are more just kind of dealing with the novel itself and ideas within that the novel. So for number 3, this topic deals with Lauren and her dilemma where she's torn between personal responsibility versus community responsibility. So with this topic you're discussing which do you find more important, or which does one have a greater commitment to, being true to themselves or to their community, and why, and how does Lauren within the novel illustrate this dilemma. For number 4, this has to do with social commentary based on future and current events. So do you think that Butler's future, which now, right, this was written in 1993, but we're already in 2020, so that future isn't that far off. Do you agree or disagree that this future Butler writes about in Parable of the Sower is possible for America? Think about current events now, and address whether or not you think the dystopia that Butler creates in Parable of the Sower is feasible based on current events and possible future events based on what's going on now in our world and our country. For number 5, this kind of sounds a lot like number 4. So we're looking at a little more specifically, not just do we think it's plausible, the future Butler creates, but do you think Butler is revisiting past societies to illustrate how our society will revert back to darker times? That's the difference between questions 4 and 5. And for question 6, this has to do with the company store. And so company store is referenced throughout the novel, where we have a situation where individuals work for room and food. So they have shelter and they have food, but they have really no control over their lives. The company controls their lives. The store, they don't get money, they just get credits, and they can never get out of debt. So this question has to do with, is the trade-off for survival, for food and shelter, worth losing your freedom and your individuality to something like a company store? And then question number 7 has to do with Lauren's hyperempathy syndrome. So in this question, you need to analyze Lauren's condition of hyperempathy syndrome and discuss how it affects her thoughts and her actions. And you might also want to address too Lauren's argument that if everyone had hyperempathy syndrome, there would be less violence in the world because other people would physically feel the pain that they inflict on others. And then the last question has to do with Lauren's religion, Earthseed, which has a God that really is not good nor evil. To Lauren, God is change. So for this question asks you to analyze Earthseed and explain how having an unemotional God that is not concerned with notions of good or evil would affect people differently than other gods, where there is this kind of notion of good and evil upon which people are judged, and then are they able to enter into an afterlife, such as heaven, based on their actions during their lifetime. So is such a God liberating to humanity, or do people need concepts such as good and evil to guide their lives? So again, if you have any questions about any of those discussion topics or essay topics, please let me know. I'm happy to explain any of the topics in more detail, or if you'd like to branch off from one of those topics and write about something different, let me know. So I have moved along to our week lessons. I don't have a lot here. I have a little bit more about dystopia and then a little bit about image and metaphor, just to kind of introduce a little bit more about some of the important ideas regarding figurative language in the novel. So, of course, we talked about the style being dystopian. That's also the genre, this type of novel, in addition to being epistolary or a series of, in this case, journal entries written to tell the story. So, as you've been reading now, you have a much better feel for how and why Parable of the Sower is a dystopian novel by Butler's use of magnifying disturbing social trends that occurred in the United States in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. I know some of you were probably not born yet, but your parents were, so I can talk to them about some of these issues if you want a little more information. So again, we know the book opened in LA, Los Angeles, California in 2024 to drought, rising seawater brought on by global warming. These, of course, are topics that you're all familiar with because they've just become worse in the years since this novel was written. Also, we read about what's left of the middle and working class trying to survive, such as Lauren's community trying to survive. And I mentioned earlier that this was a fear in the late 80s and the early 90s, this kind of growing trend of gated communities and what that might mean for the future. And Butler took that idea and made it to the situation where, such as in Lauren's community's case and many others, as Lauren and her newly formed family travel down the road, they see other communities similar to their own burning and destroyed. So public schools pretty much gone, entire towns gone, things are privatized. So to think a little more critically about what does that mean, privatized schools in entire towns, such as Oliver. And then, of course, there's the presidential candidate who, if elected, promises to bring jobs back by dismantling government programs, by loosening up environmental protection laws, by loosening up labor laws. And his slogan is to help make America great again. It's, you know, can make what you will of that with current events. But Butler actually in an interview said that she came to this vision, this dystopian future of America and specifically in California by imagining our current, and in that time was, you know, the late 80s, 1990s, current problems progressing unchecked. And then a little bit about, and this is very little, but I just kind of wanted to touch the tip of the iceberg and then let all of you think more deeply about the use of image and metaphor and other types of figurative language in the novel. So the novel takes its title, and we talked at the very beginning of the semester about the importance of titles in texts. A title is actually, you know, part of the book. It's the very first we get of the novel. So Parable of the Sower is a powerful title. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, and in this book we look at, we should be looking at similarities between that actual biblical parable and the characters in the novel and the plot of the novel. So the sower in the parable from the Bible is like the spiritual teacher who spreads the word of truth. Some people listen, others don't, just as seeds take root in some places and not in others. So in the New Testament, the sower is Jesus. In the novel, the sower is Lauren. So the metaphor of the seed occurs again, and it occurs really throughout the novel. So this is something important to think about as you're reading. So this metaphor of the seed occurs again with the name Lauren gives her new religion, which is Earthseed. And it's also reflected in the name of the first Earthseed community, which is Acorn. And I know in one of the previous videos I talked about acorns. So just a little bit more about acorn as a symbol in the novel. So Lauren loves to eat bread made from acorn. So she's grinding up the acorn, and instead of using wheat or rye as a flour, she uses acorn. And if you recall, this was previously in the book, Lauren's father tells her about how he had a really difficult time in the past convincing people in the community to not chop down the acorn trees because they felt as though they are the acorn trees, the oak trees, which produce acorns, because they thought that the oak trees weren't useful. And they proved to be very useful throughout the novel. And Lauren learns from an old book how to actually make acorn bread, which is able to sustain her and her new family or group as they travel north. So think about the acorn image, and I like to think of it as something that conveys the idea that the seeds of new life are always available, not only in nature, but in humans too. And I think we see this evidenced with some of the characters in the novel. New characters who are introduced to us that Lauren meets as she's traveling north. So kind of think about that, and there's at least that positive aspect to this otherwise really depressing environment that Lauren's in. So I have some discussion questions for you to consider as you think about these pages that you've read. Hopefully you were able to read the discussion questions prior to reading this set of pages. I have just a few things in the book pointed out that I want to mention. So on page 218, I wanted to, and kind of the several pages after, talk about Earthseed and the idea of God as change. And this page begins with the statement, change is ongoing. And so Lauren is talking about Earthseed with Travis in this part of the book. And Harry walks by and makes a comment that, as Lauren's talking about Earthseed, this is sort of like saying God is the second law of thermodynamics. And then Travis mentions entropy, the idea that the natural flow of heat is from something hot to something cold and not the other way around. So the universe itself is cooling down, running down, and dissipating its energy. Lauren seems surprised that Travis has this knowledge. But what I really wanted you to think about these following pages is this whole discussion about Lauren's concept of God. And also there are references to slavery. There are several references to slavery throughout the book. And in this particular instance, Travis and Natividad are likened as slaves to the couple that they were working from and ran away from. So Travis's mother taught him to read by sneaking books from her employer's library. And there's a reference that slaves did that 200 years ago. And another reference to the wife of the couple that Travis and Natividad worked for, helping them escape. But in slavery times, there was no such option for slaves to escape a situation such as that Natividad was in, of possibly facing rape. So just interesting to think about how Butler in this dystopia looks back from instances of slavery and envisions how they could, in this future world, be reenacted. So that's also really important to think about as you're reading this book. So on the following pages, on page 220 specifically, Lauren mentions that there's power in knowing that God can be focused, diverted, shaped by anyone at all. But there's no power in having strength and brains and yet waiting for God to fix things for you, to take revenge for you. So Lauren is arguing that people need to take action, be responsible for themselves, and not sit back and say things like, it's in God's hands, it's out of my control. She's saying the opposite, that things are very much in our control, and we need to realize this and embrace this and look at this as something positive rather than a negative. So I think that's an important notion to think about in contrast to how many people view religion and practice religion. There's also this notion that God is neither male nor female, doesn't have sex at all, isn't a person at all. And Travis asks Lauren, why personify change by calling it God? Which is a good question, right? So Lauren's response is that people forget ideas. They're more likely to remember God, especially when they're scared or desperate. So if Lauren was just talking about change as kind of this controlling idea to shape our lives, she says people wouldn't necessarily accept that. She has to attach that to something like a God figure for people to pay attention. And so I thought that was an interesting point and something that definitely think about as you book. She goes on to say on page 220 that God isn't good or evil, doesn't favor you or hate you. And so Travis responds that your God doesn't care about you at all. And Lauren's response is, all the more we care about myself and others, All the more reason to create Earthseed communities and shape God together. She says God is trickster, teacher, chaos, clay. We decide which aspect we embrace and how to deal with others. So I also thought that that was a important idea about Lauren's concept of God that should definitely be considered as you read the book. And then on page 22, Lauren talks about the idea that heaven really does exist with Earthseed, and you don't have to die to reach it. So this idea that you can achieve heaven while you're living, and you don't have to live a life in hopes of, after you die, reaching this concept of a place like heaven. It's another distinction with this religion, Earthseed. And on page 228, I just made a note of, as the story progresses, Lauren and the different people in her group are, noticing the behavior of people walking the road among them. And many of the people, as soon as there's a trap fire occurring in a community, which is going throughout the book, many communities are burning and being destroyed. She talks about how people then kind of take that opportunity to attack a community en masse. So she wonders about, and she states, one small fire was the weakness that gave scavengers permission to devastate the community. So otherwise people who may not have behaved in such a way, and also escaping what happened to them, where they lost everything because people came in and burned and plundered their communities, are now partaking in and further victimizing people. So that idea was interesting to me, and to think, do you think that the majority of people, such as in this book, would do that if they were faced with that reality? And on page 230, I just made a note. I thought it was interesting, the connection of Bankole and Ulamina, their Yoruba names. And Bankole means my house, which is a thing when you think about, as you read the last set of pages for this novel, that Lauren and her group settle on Bankole's land on the border of California and Oregon to build their community. And one more page marked. I have so much marked in the book that I didn't want to be overwhelming, so I just kind of grabbed a few highlights here and there. And this has a little bit more to do with what I previously mentioned about people turning into scavengers on other people's tragedies and weaknesses. So there's a line on page 240, or a statement, that people go animal and prey on anyone who still lives in the house after a tragedy like an earthquake or a fire. It's like an invitation to scavenge and take and steal. And then Bankole says, once people get the idea that it's all right to take what you want and destroy the rest, who knows when they'll stop. So I just, I thought it was interesting to think about this idea, and wanted to pose to you if you think that would it, in fact, happen if we were in this type of setting. Hopefully we'll never find out, but interesting to think about. And next week you'll be finishing up the book. I hope you enjoy the end. And as always, if you have any questions about any of the assignments, anything that you've read this week or last week, anytime, just let me know. Thank you.